Hello and welcome, I'm your Code Monkey. In this lecture, we're going to learn about WinForms. This is how we can build visual applications in Windows. If you just want a quick and easy way to make something visual, then this is really great. You can just drag and drop all kinds of controls like buttons, scroll bars, labels, and so on, and everything is pretty easy to use. Then of course, all the C# code that we'll learn throughout this entire course, all of that works on any of these controls. Okay, so in this course, we've been mainly using console apps. They are great for focusing on the code itself, but sometimes you might want to build something a little bit more visual, something with a proper UI. And for that, for making visual applications, we have two main options. There's WinForms or Windows Forms and WPF or Windows Presentation Foundation. Those are the two main ones. In order to be able to use them, we need to first install the modules. So open up the Visual Studio installer, and on your Visual Studio installation, let's go and modify it. Then over here under Desktop and Mobile, here we do see .NET Desktop Development. So you can see build WPF for Windows Forms and console applications using C# and so on. So yep, make sure you select this one and install it. In my case, I've already installed. And now if we open up Visual Studio and let's create a brand new project. And yep, right here we do see the things that we just added. So right away we have the two main ones that I mentioned. We've got WinForms or Windows Forms and WPF. Now for these two, WinForms, this one has been around for ages, pretty much for as long as .NET has been around. So it is very mature technology. Whereas WPF, this one is newer and has some more advanced graphics capabilities. They also have some very different architectures. WinForms, this one is very lightweight and very easy to use, while WPF is quite a bit more complex. Also, by the way, I should mention these are not the only two options. For example, one limitation of WinForms is by default, it only runs on Windows. So for cross-platform development, you have something called .NET MAUI. By the way, you might somewhere see the name Xamarin. That's what this used to be called, but Xamarin has since turned into .NET MAUI. This one is cross-platform, so you can write your code and then you can deploy it onto iOS, Android, macOS, or Windows. And also, just another quick mention. Remember how even though Unity is a game engine, that does not mean that it can only build games. You absolutely can build normal applications in Unity. Unity is really just a rendering engine. For example, I've built a controller module to control my live stream overlay. This whole thing, this is really made with Unity, even though it's really just a menu with some buttons. I've also previously built a launcher to launch all my games. So just remember how you always have that option. If you're already familiar with Unity and you want to make some non-game app, then perhaps using Unity might be a good option. But over here, when it comes to WinForms versus WPF, WinForms is really great for its simplicity, and WPF is great for more serious visuals. But like I said, if I'm building something based on visuals, I'm just going to use Unity. So for making non-Unity apps, let's learn a little bit about WinForms. Now to create, we want to create the template. However, it is not this one. Remember the whole thing that we saw in the beginning of the course? This one is using .NET Framework. That is not what we want. So up here, let's search for Windows Forms. And if we see one without .NET Framework and one with it. So it's this one over here, the one without .NET Framework. This is going to be the latest .NET version. So let's go ahead, select this one. Now let's give it some kind of name. So WinForms C# core, something like this. And let's click on next. Then for the framework, yep, let's go with .NET 8. And yep, here it is. And right away, we actually do see a difference. So instead of the code that we saw right away on the console app, instead of that, now we see a visual window right away. And if we try running this, yep, there it is. Here we have a standard Windows window. All right, awesome. So on this, you can build whatever visual program you want. On the right side, we have over here the toolbox. If we go under all the controls, yep, here they are. You can see all the tons of elements that we can add. So for example, we can add buttons, we can add checkboxes, we can add a daytime picker, we can add some fonts, we can add a label for just some text, we can have a list view, just a panel, just a picture, and so on. So basically all the elements that you're used to in any kind of Windows program, you can all find them here. Let's do something very basic. Let's just take a button. So let's click and drag the button and drop it over here on our visual window. And yep, there's our button right here. Now here we've got the usual controls that you find on pretty much any visual program. So we can move it around, we can scale it and so on. Then also on the right side, we do find over here the properties window. So this is kind of like the inspector inside of Unity. Here we can customize this object. We can modify pretty much anything. You can modify the font, the color, the text, and so on. So here, let's change the text right here. Instead of saying button 1, let's say click me. And then another very important one is to give it a proper name. So instead of button 1, let's name it the click me button. And yep, there it is. However, if we run this, there's our button, a normal Windows button. We can mouse over and change it and so on. And we can click, and it does work. We can click, but nothing happens. So let's give it some behavior. With the button selected, over here up top, we see these two little things. So this one over here is for the properties, and this one over here is for events. So here we can see all kinds of events. Now, WinForms, this is really all based on events. So you'll listen to a bunch of events like mouse click. And when that happens, then you can do some kind of logic. So you can hook onto any of these events. As you can see, there's tons of them. The simplest one is really just a click. So here you can write some kind of name for a click event function, or you can just double click for default. And if right away it opens up a view with some code. So here we've got our event. So as you can see, standard event, so object and event arg. Here we have the event where we can write whatever we want. Now just make sure you don't modify the code up here. This is the forms constructor. This is what actually runs and sets up the form with all the visuals. We can actually inspect over here the initialized component, so let's go to the definition to see. And up here is all the code for initializing and creating the form. You can see here we are constructing a brand new button, then it is setting the button location, the name, size, and so on. And then down here, setting up the form itself, setting up the dimensions, the size, the name, text, and so on. So really what we are doing here in this visual interface, all of that is really being converted into code, which then actually creates our form. Okay, so here on the form1 code, when we click, let's just fire off a normal Windows message box. So for that, we go inside the message box class, and let's just call the show function and then show something. Okay, yep, just like this, super simple. This will show a message box with some text. So let's go ahead and run. And okay, here's our button and I click. And if there you go, here's our nice message box. Okay, great. So this is really the basics of WinForms. You've got over here visual design. You've got your toolbox with a bunch of stuff. You really just drag controls and add whatever behavior you want on it. Now let's just see how to do some logic between events. So let's drag something else. Let's drag a label. So this is really just some text. So there you go, just a label. Then here on the label, again, the properties we can modify with all of this. For example, we can change the font. There you go, I just use a random font. We can modify the border style. We can modify the cursor. So let's make it with a nice hand cursor. For the border style, let's make it fixed 3D, just like that. For the padding over here, let's increase it by a bit. And if that's it, as you can see, we can modify pretty much anything on our object. And up here, we also do see some events. So again, we can add anything that is going to happen whenever we interact with this label. For example, we can add some logic on click. That works perfectly fine. But now let's say we want to click our button and on the button, change the text on our label. Now first, let's also just make sure that over here the name has a proper name. We're going to modify the text dynamically, but for the name, yep, here it is. Let's call it our text label. Okay. And now the way we access other objects is actually quite easy. We can look here on the code where we are initializing our form, and we can see, okay, we have the click me button, and over here we have the text label that we just created, and it has all the setup that we just made. And as you can see, this one is a text label, meaning it is just a simple field that is defined on this class. And this class, note how this one is a partial class, and the other one where we have our click code, this one is also a partial class. Both have the exact same name, meaning both are part of the exact same class. So to access other objects, we really just use the name because again, this class shares the other class which share the same field. So in this case, we named it our text label. So yep, here it is. There's our field, our text label. And then inside we can do whatever we want. So for example, let's change the back color. Let's call it color dot, let's say sandy brown. Then text label, let's change the for color. So this is the text color. Let's put it color.white. And then for the text label, let's modify the text itself and say, hello and welcome, I'm your code monkey. Okay, yep, that's it. Super simple. Let's test. And here we are, and there's our label. And by the way, as we mouse over, the cursor actually changes, so that's fun. Now we can click on click me, and there's the box. Click on OK, and yep, there it is. There's our text. All right, awesome. So you can see on a mouse click, we easily changed a bunch of properties on a different object. Now also here we saw one interesting thing, which is over here, it's like this by default. And when we click on this, yep, there you go. Look at this. It did not change the text right away. That is because this message box over here, this one is actually blocking the program execution. So the code over here basically stops when it gets to this line and only continues executing the rest of it when we finally dismiss this window. Basically, this is now pausing the main UI thread. And when we click on OK, that one resumes and yep, continues running the rest of the code. So this is where things like asynchronous programming become really important. It's so you can do all kinds of logic without blocking the main UI thread, which then is going to update the visual. All right, so that's the basics of WinForms. This is how you can very easily and quickly build a visual window application. It has a very intuitive workflow by just dragging and dropping some controls. And of course, all the C# code that we learned in this course, all of that can be used with any of these visual elements. So if you want to make a quick, simple visual program, then WinForms can be a great option. But also remember how Unity doesn't have to just make games. So if you want to make non-game apps, if you want something visual, you can also just make a simple Unity window.